Welcome, and continue as the narrative reaches a decisive high point, the rise of kingship, unfolding between the years 1067 and 1055 before the Common Era. In this period, the Israelites establish a monarchy for the first time, and Saul emerges as their chosen ruler. His selection is at first kept secret, taking place at Mizpah, and his early position is shaped by the difficult condition of the nation, which remains under the pressure and dominance of the Philistines. Determined to change this, Saul declares war and gathers the people at Gilgal, leading them into battle at Michmash, where the Philistines are defeated. This victory strengthens his rule, though his leadership is marked by severity and rigid decisions. He also secures success against the Ammonites, and his kingship is publicly confirmed, establishing his authority. Saul forms a royal court, appoints officers, and maintains a standing army, marking a shift toward organized governance. He continues his campaigns, including a significant victory over the Amalekites, but his relationship with Samuel deteriorates due to disputes over obedience and authority. As Saul wages war against neighboring peoples, including conflict with the Gibeonites, religious life continues at places such as Jabon. Meanwhile, a new figure rises during the war against the Philistines in the valley of Terebinth, where the young David defeats the formidable warrior Goliath. The meeting between Saul and David marks the beginning of a dramatic shift. David's growing success and popularity awaken deep jealousy in Saul, which gradually turns into instability and madness. This leads to a relentless persecution of David, as Saul seeks to eliminate the one he now sees as a rival. The chapter concludes with Saul's final battle against the Philistines, where the Israelites suffer defeat, and Saul himself meets his end, bringing his troubled reign to a close. The establishment of a kingdom in Israel marked a moment of profound transformation and tension in the history of the people. The man who was elevated to the throne through the eager insistence of the Israelites, and with the reluctant consent of Samuel, demonstrated more decisively than any argument could have done how ill-suited a monarchical system was to the expectations of the nation. Saul, the first king of Israel, had been, before his accession, a simple man of upright character, with no ambition for power or authority. Yet, once crowned, he did not hesitate to employ cruelty and inhumanity when he deemed it necessary to assert the dignity and authority of his office. By the guidance of prophetic counsel, care had been taken that Saul should not resemble the earlier, more dangerous prototype of monarchical ambition, such as Abimelech, who in his arrogance had murdered his own brothers and devastated entire districts. Saul was chosen from the smallest of the tribes, the tribe of Benjamin, and from the humblest family within it, that of Matri. His father, Kish, was a simple and upright countryman, notable only for his honesty and integrity. Saul himself was a man content with the quiet life of the village, occupied with his father's flocks and with tending the fields. He had no thought for power beyond the horizon of his home and almost no conception of the wider world of kingship. His humble origins and simple character were expected to prevent presumption and pride from entering the first monarchy of Israel. The circumstances of his election left a profound impression upon those present. Samuel declared to the assembly, "This is the man whom God has chosen as king. There is none like him in all Israel." The people, carried by the solemnity of the occasion and by the striking presence of Saul, cried out together, "Long live the king!" Samuel anointed Saul with holy oil, a ritual believed to confer divine inviolability and sanctity upon the chosen ruler. The elders rejoiced that their long-cherished desire for a king to unify and guide them was finally realized, and they looked forward with hope to an era of order and prosperity. Yet even in the midst of celebration, discord had begun to surface. Some, probably members of the tribe of Ephraim who had expected the crown to come from their ranks, oddly expressed their dissatisfaction, questioning Saul's ability to lead. While most elders paid homage and offered gifts to the king, and a few courageous followers accompanied him to his hometown of Jabba to support him against Israel's enemies, the discontented kept apart, refusing to swear loyalty to the new monarch. Despite these tensions, Saul's courage seemed to grow in proportion to the responsibility now entrusted to him. The humiliating condition of the Israelites at the time of his accession demanded extraordinary resolve. Their arms, including bows, arrows, and swords, had been seized by the victorious Philistines, who had also eliminated any local craftsmen capable of forging new weapons. Saul thus assumed the throne without a sword, the symbol of authority and martial power across all nations, and his election was so secretive that the Philistines remained unaware. The Philistine tax collectors drained the strength of the nation and suppressed any attempt at revolt, forcing some Israelites to accompany them in military expeditions against their own kin. It was only by a miraculous combination of courage, strategy, and leadership that Saul, along with his son and kinsmen, began to restore the freedom and security of the people. Saul's eldest son, Jonathan, displayed qualities that sometimes surpassed even his father's suitability for kingship. He was modest, unselfish, and courageous in the face of mortal danger, endowed with a kindness and gentleness that won him the love of the people. His enthusiastic and sincere nature inspired devotion, yet it could have been a liability for a ruler required to exercise firmness and authority. Abner, in contrast, was a seasoned warrior, rigid in resolve and cunning in strategy. To the inexperienced king and the people alike, Abner's guidance was indispensable in navigating the precarious position of Israel amidst the surrounding enemies and internal disunity. Supported by his close followers, by members of his own family, and especially by the tribe of Benjamin, to which he belonged, Saul prepared to face the Philistines. The tribe of Benjamin, a small but determined group among the Israelites, took pride in Saul, for through him they had gained new importance among the tribes. Yet the struggle ahead was unequal. The Philistines were well armed, organized, and experienced in warfare, while the Israelites were poorly equipped and divided. The first move in this conflict was made by Jonathan, the son of Saul. Jonathan was bold and decisive. In the town known as Geba, also called Geba of Benjamin, there was a Philistine outpost. This post included officials who collected tribute from the Israelites, along with a strong military presence to enforce control. Jonathan attacked this position and destroyed the garrison. This act marked the formal beginning of war. It was not done in secret or without authority. It was carried out with the full approval and command of Saul, who had now taken on the role of king. After this action, Saul ordered that the signal of war should be announced throughout the land of Benjamin. A trumpet blast, used in ancient times to summon people and declare important events, was sounded. The message spread quickly. For some, this news brought hope and excitement, as it promised an end to foreign domination. For others, it brought fear, as they understood the strength of the enemy they were about to face. Those who had courage gathered around Saul. They were prepared to stand with him, determined either to remove the humiliation that had long burdened their people or to lose their lives in the attempt. But not all shared this resolve. Many who lacked courage fled. Some crossed to the eastern side of the Jordan River, seeking safety. Others hid in caves, in narrow openings among rocks, or in underground passages. Fear spread widely, and uncertainty filled every mind. The place chosen for assembling the Israelite forces was Gilgal, a town located at a distance from the main territory of the Philistines. This location had been designated by Samuel, the prophet and spiritual leader of the people. Samuel had instructed Saul to go to Gilgal and wait there for 7 days. During that time, Saul was to await Samuel's arrival, as the prophet would provide guidance believed to come from divine authority. Gilgal was not only a gathering place for warriors. It likely also served as a center for religious activity, where groups of musicians and prophets were present. These individuals would chant psalms and sing songs intended to strengthen the courage of the soldiers and remind them of their shared purpose and faith. While the Israelites waited, the Philistines prepared for a decisive campaign. Jonathan's attack had angered them deeply. At the same time, they were astonished. They regarded the Israelites as weak, unarmed, and submissive. It seemed almost unthinkable that such a people would dare to challenge them. In response, the Philistines assembled a large force. Their army included infantry and mounted units, giving them a clear advantage. They advanced through the valleys of the southern mountain region belonging to the tribe of Ephraim, moving across the land until they reached a place called Michmash. From this central position, they sent out raiding groups in several directions, spreading destruction and asserting control. In a humiliating development, some Israelites were compelled to assist the Philistines in these operations against their own people. This was a moment of great danger for Israel. As the Philistines advanced toward Michmash, Saul remained at Gilgal, surrounded by the warriors who had chosen to stay. He waited for Samuel, whose presence was expected to provide guidance and assurance. However, the days passed, and Samuel did not come. Each passing day increased the tension. The delay was interpreted by some as a sign of misfortune. Confidence began to weaken. Saul feared that if he waited longer, the Philistines would descend from the higher ground into the valley where Gilgal was located. If that happened, his small and unprepared force might be destroyed. Meanwhile, some of his soldiers lost hope and deserted, believing that the absence of Samuel meant that success was unlikely. On the seventh day, unable to wait any longer, Saul decided to act. According to the customs of the time, he offered a sacrifice. This act was meant to seek favor from the deity and ensure success in battle. It was a role usually reserved for a prophet or priest, but Saul took it upon himself in his urgency. At that very moment, Samuel arrived. He rebuked Saul sharply for his impatience and for acting outside his proper role. Samuel regarded this as a serious failure of judgment. After expressing his disapproval, he left Gilgal, withdrawing his support. This departure was a heavy blow to Saul, who had depended on Samuel's guidance at this critical time. With Samuel gone, Saul could no longer remain at Gilgal. He moved his remaining forces to Gibeah. When he counted his soldiers there, he found that only about 600 men remained. This was a very small number, especially considering that they faced a well-equipped enemy. Most of these men had no proper weapons. Only Saul and his son Jonathan possessed swords. The rest had to rely on simple tools or improvised means. This early period of Saul's rule, which might have been expected to bring strength and unity, instead revealed the weakness of the new kingdom. One of the most difficult aspects for Saul was the absence of Samuel, whose presence had provided a sense of divine direction. Despite these challenges, Jonathan did not lose resolve. While the Israelite forces were stationed at Gibeah, the Philistine army remained nearby at Michmash. The two camps were separated by a valley. This valley was difficult to cross. On one side, steep rock walls formed a narrow passage that became almost impassable. On the other side, where the path widened, the Philistines had placed guards. The only way for the two forces to meet was through this narrow and dangerous route. Seeing this situation, Jonathan made a bold decision. Accompanied only by his armor-bearer, a young man who carried his weapons, he chose to climb the steep rocks leading toward the Philistine position. The ascent was dangerous. The rocks were sharp and uneven, and a single misstep could have resulted in a fatal fall. Nevertheless, both men succeeded in reaching the top. When the Philistines saw them, they were surprised. They had believed the path to be inaccessible. Seeing only two men approach, they mocked them, calling out that the Hebrews were coming out of hiding and inviting them to come closer. Jonathan and his armor-bearer had already agreed that such a challenge would be their signal to attack. They advanced without hesitation. In the first encounter, they struck down about 20 men. Lacking conventional weapons, they used stones and slings. The tribe of Benjamin, to which Jonathan belonged, was known for skill in using slings as weapons. Jonathan and his companion continued their assault, hurling stones with precision. The suddenness of the attack caused confusion among the Philistines. They had not expected an assault from that direction. Fear spread quickly through their ranks. Unable to understand how such an attack was possible, they began to imagine that they were facing something beyond ordinary human strength. Panic took hold. In the confusion, they turned against one another, striking their own comrades or fleeing in disorder. From a position of height, the newly chosen leader of Israel, Saul, son of Kish, observed the unfolding struggle. Saul, who had only recently been raised to kingship over the tribes of Israel, watched as the opposing force, the Philistines, began to falter. The Philistines were a powerful people settled along the coastal regions, one feared by the Israelites for their military strength and advanced weapons. The moment Saul perceived signs of retreat among the enemy, he did not hesitate. With urgency, he descended from his elevated position, accompanied by 600 warriors who formed his immediate force. These men followed him into the field of conflict, where they joined the battle and brought it to completion. The Philistines, already shaken, were driven into full defeat. A remarkable turn then took place among the Israelites themselves. Some among them had previously been forced by the Philistines into submission, even compelled to fight against their own people. But now, seeing the enemy in flight, they reversed their allegiance. They turned their weapons against those who had oppressed them. At the same time, others who had hidden in fear taking refuge in caves, narrow clefts, and natural shelters within the mountainous region of Ephraim, a central territory inhabited by one of the leading tribes of Israel, gained courage. Witnessing the collapse of the Philistine forces, they emerged and joined the advancing Israelites. The number of Saul's followers rapidly increased. What had begun as a small force grew into an army of 10,000 men. As the defeated Philistines fled across the region of Mount Ephraim, every town through which they passed became a place of resistance. The inhabitants of these towns rose against them, striking them down as they attempted to escape. Though exhausted from the strain of battle and pursuit, Saul's forces continued relentlessly, chasing their enemies for a period of 8 hours. Yet in the midst of this victory, an event occurred that, though seemingly minor, carried serious consequences. Before the pursuit had begun, Saul had issued a strict command, determined that nothing should interrupt the destruction of the enemy. He forbade his soldiers from eating or taking any form of nourishment. To enforce this order, he pronounced a curse upon anyone who disobeyed. Jonathan, the son of Saul, a courageous and active leader who often took the lead in battle, had not heard this command. Weakened by the exertion of fighting and pursuing the enemy, he came upon wild honey. Using his staff, he dipped it into the honey and tasted it, seeking relief from his exhaustion. When others informed him of the command his father had given, Jonathan did not deny his action. He openly acknowledged what he had done. Saul, however, treated this act as a serious violation. Bound by the oath he had declared, he resolved to put his own son to death. This decision was met with strong opposition from the people. The warriors, who had witnessed Jonathan's bravery and leadership, protested with force. They declared that it was through Jonathan's efforts that the victory had been achieved. They refused to allow harm to come to him, insisting that not even the smallest injury should be inflicted upon him. To resolve the matter, the people offered a sin offering on Jonathan's behalf. This act served to remove the consequence of the curse and spared him from death. However, the incident brought the pursuit to an end. The Israelites did not continue their advance beyond the region west of Ajalon, a location marking the extent of their progress. Despite this interruption, the victory brought great joy to the Israelites. The battle, known as the Battle of Michmash, restored their standing and confidence. For a long time, they had been weakened and disarmed under Philistine control. Now, they had regained their weapons and felt renewed strength. They were ready to follow a king whose determination they had witnessed in action. Yet Saul himself did not allow the success to elevate him beyond his former way of life. After the victory, he returned quietly to his home in Gibeah, a town in the territory of Benjamin. There, he resumed his previous occupation, working in the fields of his father. At this stage, his new position as king had not altered his personal conduct. While these events unfolded, a new threat arose from another direction. The Ammonites, a neighboring people located to the east of the Jordan River, intensified their attacks against the Israelite tribes living in that region. Their leader, Nash, the king of the Ammonites, advanced against the city of Jabesh-Gilead. This city was a fortified settlement east of the Jordan, inhabited by Israelites. Unable to withstand the siege for long, the people of Jabesh-Gilead sought to negotiate with Nash. They attempted to secure terms for surrender. However, the condition imposed upon them was harsh and humiliating. Nash demanded that every man in the city lose his right eye, an act intended to bring disgrace upon all Israel. Faced with this demand, the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead requested a delay of 7 days. During this time, they sent messengers throughout the land of Israel, seeking help from their fellow tribes. One day, as Saul was returning from the fields, guiding a pair of oxen used for plowing, he encountered the people of Gibeah. They were in a state of distress, overcome with grief. Seeing this, Saul asked the reason for their sorrow. The messengers from Jabesh-Gilead explained the situation, describing the condition that had been imposed and the urgency of their need for assistance. Saul was filled with anger at the insult directed toward his people. The demand made by Nash was not only cruel but intended to shame the entire nation. In response, Saul took decisive action. For the first time, he fully exercised the authority of his position as king. He issued a call to all the tribes of Israel, summoning them to unite in a campaign against the Ammonites. Samuel, the prophet and spiritual leader of the people, supported this call. He declared that he would join the campaign as well, reinforcing the unity of purpose between religious authority and royal power. In response to Saul's command, the warriors of Israel assembled at a designated meeting place. This gathering marked a turning point. The period of disorder that had characterized the time of the judges, when leadership was temporary and fragmented, came to an end. In its place stood a single, firm authority directing the nation. A large force of Israelites crossed the Jordan River to confront the Ammonites. The attack was carried out with coordination, striking from multiple directions south, north, and west. The Ammonite forces were unable to withstand this assault. They were scattered in all directions, completely defeated, so that not even small groups remained together. The people of Jabesh Gilead were delivered from their danger. In gratitude for the swift and determined action taken by Saul, they remained loyal to him and to his descendants in the years that followed. After securing the second victory, Saul returned across the Jordan. He was welcomed with great celebration. The people expressed their joy openly, recognizing the success and strength of their king. Samuel, present at this moment of triumph, understood the risk that such success could lead to pride. He saw the need to guide both the king and the people. He reminded them that victory should not lead to arrogance, and that kingship was not an end in itself, but a means to serve a higher purpose. To reinforce this message, Samuel called for a large assembly of the Israelites. At this gathering, he renewed the anointing of Saul as king, symbolically affirming his position. The people once again pledged their loyalty, and offerings were made in a spirit of rejoicing. Amid these celebrations, Samuel stood before the people and delivered a speech. His words reflected both his wisdom and his authority as a prophet, addressing the responsibilities that lay before the king and the nation. The early victories of Saul, together with the great gathering at Gilgal, where nearly all the tribes of Israel had acknowledged him as king, firmly established his authority. What had begun as a new and uncertain form of rule now took on a stable and lasting character. The royal power was no longer temporary. It became a permanent institution among the Israelites. Although Samuel, who had guided the people through earlier times, often spoke with respect to the age of the judges, when leaders arose in times of need, the people themselves had come to desire something different. They found in a king a clear symbol of unity and strength. The independence they had once held as separate tribes was willingly set aside. In its place, they accepted the authority of a single ruler, believing that unity would bring greater power. With the establishment of kingship came many changes. Saul could no longer act alone. He required men to carry out his commands. A system of organization began to form around him. Officers were appointed over groups of soldiers, some commanding hundreds, others thousands. Advisors were chosen, men who shared in the king's decisions and sat at his table. Alongside them was a special group known as runners, an armed force that acted swiftly and directly under the king's orders. These men, together with their leaders, formed the royal court. At the head of Saul's guard stood Doeg the Edomite, a man not originally from Israel, but from the people of Edom. His presence showed that Saul's authority extended beyond traditional tribal boundaries. Because of this growing court and standing army, the town of Jibah, which had once been small and of little importance, became the center of royal power, effectively serving as the capital of the kingdom. In the early part of his reign, Saul showed obedience to Samuel. When the prophet, speaking in the name of God, commanded him to wage a war of complete destruction against the Amalekites, Saul did not hesitate. He gathered his forces and prepared for battle. The Amalekites were long-standing enemies of Israel. From earlier times, especially during the journey through the wilderness after leaving Egypt, they had attacked the Israelites with cruelty. They were known for joining with other nations in efforts to destroy Israel. Their king, Agag, had caused particular trouble, especially to the tribe of Judah. The campaign against them was not an easy undertaking. Agag was regarded as a powerful and feared leader. His people were known for their strength and courage. Yet Saul advanced with determination. Through skill and planning, he drew the Amalekite forces into a trap, an ambush that allowed him to overcome them completely. He captured their main city, believed to be near Kadesh, and destroyed its inhabitants. Men, women, and children were put to death. King Agag himself was taken alive. Only a small number escaped, fleeing into the desert that stretched toward Egypt. The Israelite soldiers gathered large amounts of spoil from the victory. They took flocks of sheep, herds of cattle, and camels. According to the command given through Samuel, all of this was to be destroyed, so that nothing would remain to preserve the memory of Amalek. However, the soldiers were unwilling to give up such valuable possessions. Saul, who had previously shown strict discipline, allowed them to keep the best of the spoil. In doing so, he failed to carry out the command he had received. At the same time, Saul took pride in his victory. He displayed Agag as a captive, a visible sign of his success. His triumph affected him deeply, leading him away from the humility he had once shown. On his return, he even set up a monument in Carmel to commemorate his achievement. Meanwhile, Samuel became aware, through what was described as a prophetic vision, that Saul had not obeyed the command given to him. The consequence was severe. Saul was to face punishment for his disobedience. Samuel struggled with the task before him. He spent an entire night in distress and prayer, knowing he must confront the king. At last, he set out to meet Saul. On the way, he learned of the monument that Saul had erected, a sign of pride. Instead of continuing forward, Samuel turned toward Gilgal. When Saul heard that Samuel had gone there, he followed him. The elders of the tribe of Benjamin, Saul's own tribe, along with leaders from nearby tribes, also came to Gilgal to honor the victorious king. There, in that gathering, a confrontation took place that revealed deep tension and signaled future trouble. Saul approached Samuel as if nothing had gone wrong. He declared that he had carried out the command given to him. Samuel responded with a question that exposed the truth. He asked about the sound of sheep, the evidence that the spoil had not been destroyed. Saul attempted to explain. He said that the people had spared the best of the animals in order to offer them as sacrifices. At this, Samuel spoke with sharp authority. He declared that obedience was more important than sacrifice, that listening to divine instruction held greater value than offerings. He compared rebellion to acts of forbidden practices and stubbornness to the worship of false household gods, known as teraphim. Because Saul had rejected the command, Samuel declared that he himself would be rejected as king. These words struck Saul deeply. He admitted his fault and, in desperation, tried to prevent Samuel from leaving. He grasped the prophet's robe so firmly that it tore. Samuel then gave this act a symbolic meaning, saying that just as the garment had been torn, so the kingdom would be taken from Saul and given to another, even if this would bring division to the nation. Saul pleaded again, asking Samuel at least to show him honor before the elders of Israel. In response to this request, Samuel agreed to accompany him to the place of worship. There, Saul bowed himself in humility before God. Samuel then called for the captive king, Agag, to be brought forward. The defeated ruler expressed fear, speaking of the bitterness of death. Samuel answered by declaring that as Agag had caused suffering, so he would now face the same fate. Then, in the presence of Saul at Gilgal, Samuel put Agag to death. After this moment, the relationship between Saul and Samuel changed completely. They no longer met as before. The victory over the Amalekites, which had seemed to strengthen Saul's position, became instead a turning point that weakened him. His pride was broken, and the declaration that he had been rejected weighed heavily upon him. A shadow settled over his mind. The words spoken by Samuel, that the kingdom would be given to another, remained with him. They echoed within him and shaped his thoughts. The same man who had once hesitated to accept kingship now struggled to hold on to it, even as he felt powerless to change what had been declared. Unable to overcome this burden, Saul turned his attention to warfare. Enemies still surrounded Israel, and he sought to engage them in battle. At the same time, he took steps to strengthen his authority, attempting to impress upon the people the importance and power of his position as king. Among the Israelites still lived a few Canaanite families and small clans who had not been expelled during the original conquest of the land and could not now be removed. These remnants had long exerted a pernicious influence upon the Israelites, leading them into the worship of false gods and the indulgence in idolatrous practices. King Saul, understanding the danger these idolatrous neighbors posed to the moral and spiritual welfare of the nation, determined to act decisively. He believed that by eliminating these foreign elements, he would strengthen Israel and honor the law of God. Among the groups who had been allowed to remain were the men of Gibeon, who had voluntarily submitted to the Israelites during the conquest. Saul, however, disregarded the solemn oath that had been sworn to the Gibeonites and commanded a wholesale massacre, sparing only a few who escaped. In addition to the Canaanite nations, Saul also persecuted the sorcerers who had participated in idolatrous ceremonies. While he endeavored to gain the favor of his people and to present himself as a steadfast champion of the divine law, he simultaneously sought to impress the nation with all of royal authority. He donned a golden crown upon his head as a visible sign of his exalted status, ensuring that those who had once known him as a humble plowman would now regard him with reverence. Saul also embraced the royal privilege of polygamy, taking wives beyond his first wife, Ahinoam, whom he had married during his peasant life. Among his additional wives was Rizpah, known for both her courage and her beauty. Saul's martial energy was evident in the numerous raids he led against Israel's enemies. and he cultivated a display of pomp and ceremony to bolster the nation's confidence and suppress any lingering fear provoked by the stern warnings of the prophet. Yet even as he pursued these grand gestures of kingship, an unforeseen presence would soon challenge his authority in the form of a youth whose courage and skill would leave an indelible mark on Israel. During one tense confrontation with the Philistines, the two armies arrayed themselves across a deep ravine, hesitant to make the first move. The Philistines proposed that the battle be decided by single combat, sending forth their champion, the enormous warrior Goliath. King Saul, recognizing the challenge, promised the victor wealth, exemption from taxes, freedom from compulsory service, and the hand of one of his daughters. Yet despite these inducements, none of Saul's seasoned soldiers dared confront the formidable Philistine. It was then that a shepherd boy from the village of Bethlehem stepped forward, altering the course of history. This youth, David, whose name would later resonate across the world, became the agent of a decisive revolution in Israel. Samuel, the prophet, had been secretly dispatched to Bethlehem to anoint the future king from among the 8 sons of Jesse. Acting in secrecy to avoid interference from Saul, Samuel selected David, anointing him in the presence of his brothers. This simple yet monumental act was kept private, known only to David's father and siblings. Jesse, David's father, was of humble origin, as were all the inhabitants of Bethlehem, and David, at approximately 18 years of age, had yet to distinguish himself by experience or heroic deeds. His world had been confined to the pastures surrounding Bethlehem, yet within him lay dormant faculties, intellectual and spiritual, that would surpass his contemporaries just as Saul's physical prowess had. David possessed extraordinary musical and poetic talent, and as he tended his flock, his harp awakened echoes through the hills. Samuel returned to Ramah as discreetly as he had departed, nurturing David's talents in poetry, music, and, most importantly, in piety and devotion to God. David frequently traveled between Bethlehem and Samuel's house in Ramah, cultivating both his skill and his spiritual character. When the Philistines once again threatened Israel near Bethlehem, David, no longer able to remain a mere shepherd, seized the opportunity to visit his brothers in the army, bringing with him the pretext of delivering provisions. In the camp, he bravely volunteered to confront the blaspheming Philistine who defied the army of the living God. The news reached King Saul, who, half skeptical and half intrigued, granted permission for David to engage in the duel, offering him his own armor. Yet David, confident in his skill and divine guidance, set aside the armor, relying instead on his sling. A single stone, hurled with precision, struck Goliath from a distance, felling the towering warrior. David then advanced, drew Goliath's own sword, and severed his head. The Philistines, witnessing the death of their champion from the hilltops, recognized defeat and fled to the safety of their strongholds. The Israelites, emboldened by this extraordinary victory, pursued their enemies vigorously, marking a turning point in the struggle against the Philistines and heralding the rise of David as a central figure in the destiny of Israel. Holding the severed and bleeding head of the giant in his hand, the youthful victor, David, was led before King Saul, who until that moment had not known of the boy's courage and skill. Saul could not imagine that this young man, from whom he could not hide his admiration, might one day become a formidable rival. Joy and relief filled Saul's heart at the signal victory. His son Jonathan, renowned for his open, tender, and selfless nature, became deeply attached to David. The affection between Jonathan and David grew stronger than that of any earthly love, surpassing even the bonds of friendship or romance. News of David's triumph at Estamin, the place where he had struck down Goliath, spread swiftly throughout the valley of the Terebinths and across the territories of all Israelite tribes. Yet David returned quietly to his father Jesse's household, carrying only Goliath's shield and armor as tokens of his feat. He did not linger at home for long. The destiny of King Saul had begun to unfold, and David was chosen as the instrument of that destiny. The gloom that had weighed heavily on Saul since his breach with the prophet Samuel deepened. His moods darkened into melancholy, and at times violent fits of madness overtook him. Whispered among his servants was the observation that an evil spirit had entered the king. Only the sound of music could soothe him. Saul's attendants proposed bringing a skilled musician and poet to the court, advising him to select David, the son of Jesse of Bethlehem. David was handsome, courageous, eloquent, and a gifted harpist. Once brought to the king, David's music lifted Saul from his melancholic fits, calming his troubled mind. Saul grew dependent on the young man, treating him almost as a son. Eventually, he asked Jesse to leave David permanently at the royal court. To secure the benefit of David's presence, Saul appointed him as his armor-bearer, ensuring that David would remain close. David's influence extended beyond the king. His courage, skill, and charm attracted the admiration of the entire court. Yet it was Jonathan, Saul's son, whose loyalty and love for David surpassed that of any other. Michal, Saul's second daughter, secretly devoted herself to David. At court, David was trained in the use of weapons, complementing his musical talents with martial skills. Courageous by nature, he distinguished himself in minor skirmishes, emerging victorious. On one occasion, after defeating a significant force of Philistine warriors, David was celebrated as he returned across Israelite territory. Women and young maidens greeted him in every city he passed, singing, dancing, and playing timbrels and cymbals. They proclaimed his victories aloud, saying, "Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands." The exuberant acclaim spread rapidly, and all Israel recognized David's heroism. For Saul, the celebration became a bitter revelation. The man whom Samuel had declared the better one, chosen by God to be king, now stood openly before him, loved by the people and admired for deeds that outshone the king himself. Saul's joy turned swiftly to fear and hatred. He lamented aloud, "To me they give but thousands, and to him tens of thousands. What remains to make him king?" The shouts of triumph, the songs of women, and the memory of Samuel's words haunted Saul. Hatred festered in his heart and soon grew into madness. The very day after David's victorious return, Saul's frenzy erupted. Twice he hurled a spear at David, who avoided each thrust with agility. When the violent fit subsided, Saul interpreted David's survival as proof that God protected his rival. From that moment, Saul sought to destroy David by subtle schemes and treachery. Feigning favor, Saul appointed David as leader of a select force of 1,000 men, commanding him to lead attacks of great danger and significance. Saul hoped that these missions would place David in peril. He offered his eldest daughter, Merab, in marriage, expecting David to fall into ruin through this apparent honor. David, however, declined the marriage, avoiding the trap. Saul then promised his second daughter, Michal, if David could bring proof of killing 100 Philistine warriors. David not only fulfilled the requirement, but brought evidence of slaying twice that number. Saul was compelled to give Michal in marriage. Both she and Jonathan stood with David, deepening Saul's anger. Saul's enmity escalated into active pursuit. David became a fugitive, forced to live in hiding. He gathered around him youths and men who were equally desperate and eager for action. At the forefront of this group was Joab, a kinsman of David, who with his two brothers formed the nucleus of a band of heroic warriors, the Gibborim. A prophet named Gad, a member of Samuel's prophetic school, also joined him. Meanwhile, Saul's hatred extended to the remaining priests descended from Eli, the high priest. Those who had aided David were hunted down. The priestly city of Nob was destroyed, and nearly all members of the sacerdotal family were slain. Only one family, that of Abiathar, escaped. They fled to David, who received them with protection and honor. Saul's obsession with eliminating his rival had transformed him into a cruel and bloodthirsty tyrant. Efforts by Jonathan to reconcile father and friend failed, widening the divide. While a portion of the nation quietly supported David, they could only offer secret aid, enabling him to evade Saul's repeated attempts on his life. In his wanderings, David was obliged to form alliances with neighboring rulers, including the king of Moab, the Ammonite king Nash, and the Philistine king Achish. These alliances, though practical, created the impression that David had betrayed Israel, thus reinforcing Saul's fear and hatred, especially after his temporary refuge with Achish. A man named Achish, who was the king of the Philistines in the city of Gath, granted protection to David, the son of Jesse, who had fled from King Saul of Israel. This protection, however, was not given freely. It came with strict and binding conditions. David was required to break entirely with Saul, who was both his king and his father-in-law, and with his own people, the Israelites. In return for safety, David was expected, in times of war, to join the Philistine forces with his own band of 600 men and fight against Israel. In times of peace, he was to lead raids against distant regions of the territory of Judah, which belonged to his own tribe, and then present part of the captured goods, known as booty, to Achish as a sign of loyalty. David, however, did not intend to remain faithful to these conditions. It appears that he planned to avoid fulfilling them fully and hoped, at a later time, to stand once more with his own people. Yet, by entering into this agreement, he was forced into a position of deception. The direct and honest purpose that had once marked his conduct began to give way to more complex and indirect actions. The appearance and behavior of David's followers, hardened by life in the wilderness and constant conflict, likely caused unease among the settled inhabitants of Philistia. The leaders of the Philistines, who governed different cities under their king, were not pleased. They were troubled that their ruler had formed an alliance with a man whose fame had been built on victories against their own nation. Despite their warnings, Achish remained confident in his decision, believing that David's separation from Israel made him a dependable ally. David himself did not feel at ease living among the Philistines. Recognizing this, he requested from Achish a separate place of residence for himself and his men, away from the main population. Achish agreed to this request and assigned to David the town of Ziklag, a fortified settlement under Philistine control. Once it became known that David had been given his own city, many others came to join him. These included both foreigners and Israelites, men skilled in warfare, who would later distinguish themselves through acts of bravery. Achish interpreted this development as further proof of David's loyalty, believing that David was strengthening his position by fighting against his own people and thus making any future reconciliation impossible. Confident in this alliance, Achish prepared for a decisive campaign against Israel. At the same time, Saul, the king of Israel, was in a weakened state. He had fallen into deep sadness and had lost much of the energy that had once made him a strong leader. His separation from David had deprived him of a capable commander and a trusted strategist. Many of the most courageous men of Israel had chosen to follow David instead, leaving Saul with diminished support. Achish gathered a large army, composed of thousands of soldiers, intending to deliver a final and powerful blow against Israel. He led his forces along the coastal plain beside the Mediterranean Sea, a region controlled by the Philistines after earlier victories over the Phoenicians, a seafaring people of that coast. From there, he advanced inland into the valley of Jezreel, a broad and level region well suited for the use of cavalry and war chariots, unlike the mountainous terrain of Israel. Because of the agreement between them, Achish required David to join this campaign and bring his men into the Philistine army. David found himself in a difficult and troubling position. He was bound by his agreement, yet he was being called to fight against his own people. He had little choice but to accompany the army. The situation was resolved unexpectedly. The rulers of the Philistine cities, who served as nobles under Achish, strongly objected to David's presence. They did not trust him and feared that, in the midst of battle, he might turn against them. Their protest was loud and forceful, almost amounting to open defiance of the king. Under this pressure, Achish was compelled to dismiss David. Although he expressed continued confidence in David's loyalty, he sent him back to Ziklag. This decision spared David from a difficult choice between betraying his own nation or breaking his agreement with Achish. Meanwhile, the Philistine army continued its advance and set up camp near the town of Shunem, located in the valley of Jezreel. Saul, having received reports of the Philistine preparations and their approach, gathered the Israelite forces. He moved quickly to meet the threat, first encamping at the foot of Mount Gilboa, a range of hills overlooking the valley. He then maneuvered his forces around the heights and established a position near Endor, to the northwest of the mountain range. As Saul observed the size and strength of the Philistine army, especially their cavalry, his courage began to fail. The troubles he had faced, many of which were the result of his own actions, weighed heavily on him. He felt abandoned by God. In earlier times, he might have sought guidance from priests or prophets, but now no answer came. He waited for a dream or a sign, but none appeared. In his despair, Saul turned to a source he had once rejected. He sought out a woman in Endor who practiced ventriloquism and claimed to communicate with spirits, an activity he had previously forbidden in his kingdom. She had continued her practices in secret. Saul, now in need, approached her to seek knowledge of the future. This act marked a sharp contrast with his earlier efforts to remove such practices from Israel. The message he received from the woman was troubling and offered no comfort. Burdened by this prediction, Saul entered the battle with a heavy and uncertain mind. The conflict that followed lasted an entire day. The Israelites fought with determination, but they were at a disadvantage. The open plain allowed the Philistines to use their cavalry and chariots effectively, giving them a clear advantage. Eventually, the Israelite forces were driven back toward the mountains of Gilboa. The Philistines pursued them and inflicted a complete defeat. During the battle, Saul's 3 sons were killed. These were Jonathan, known for his loyalty and courage, Abinadab, and Malchishua. With their deaths, Saul found himself isolated, accompanied only by his armor-bearer, a servant responsible for carrying his weapons. As the Philistine archers closed in, Saul faced capture. Unwilling to be taken prisoner and subjected to humiliation, Saul asked his armor-bearer to end his life. The servant refused to harm his king. Left with no other option, Saul took his own sword and fell upon it, choosing death rather than capture. The defeat was devastating. Many of the finest warriors of Israel lay dead on Mount Gilboa and in the valley below. The loss marked a severe blow to the nation. The following day, the Philistines returned to the battlefield to collect the spoils. They removed clothing and valuable items from the fallen. Among the dead, they found the bodies of Saul and his sons. They took Saul's head and his weapons as trophies and sent them to their cities in Philistia. His skull was placed in the temple of Dagon, a deity worshipped by the Philistines, while his weapons were placed in a temple dedicated to Astarte, another deity, to commemorate their victory. The Philistines then advanced into the surrounding regions. They occupied towns in the valley of Jezreel and extended their control into the northeastern territories near the Jordan River. The inhabitants of these areas, upon hearing of the defeat, had already fled across the river to escape. As an act of insult, the Philistines displayed the bodies of Saul and his son Jonathan on the walls of the city of Bethshan. Continuing their advance, they moved southward from Mount Gilboa and Bethshan, taking control of key towns. The capital city of Saul, known as Jiba, was thrown into panic as news of the approach spread. The inhabitants fled to the mountains for safety. In the confusion, an event occurred that would have lasting consequences. Jonathan's young son, Mephibosheth, who was 5 years old, was being carried to safety by his nurse. In her haste, she dropped him, and the child was injured, leaving him permanently unable to walk properly. When Saul came to the end of his life, the condition of the land he left behind was deeply troubled. The situation had not improved during his reign. Instead, it had declined, becoming even worse than it had been at the time when he first rose to power. The hopes that had once surrounded his election had given way to discouragement and weakness. A great defeat had fallen upon the Israelites. It came suddenly and with such force that it broke their ability to respond. The loss was so complete and so unexpected that the people did not even attempt to resist. Their courage had disappeared. Fear and confusion took its place. In this moment of collapse, even a small act of loyalty appeared extraordinary. From the town of Jabesh Gilead, located on the eastern side of the Jordan River, a group of men resolved to act. They remembered that Saul had once come to their aid in a time of danger. Out of gratitude for that earlier help, they chose to honor him even after his death. The bodies of Saul and his son Jonathan had been exposed by their enemies in a public display of humiliation. This act was meant to show defeat and to strip away dignity. The men of Jabesh Gilead could not accept this. Under cover of night, they crossed the Jordan River and made their way to Bethshan, where the bodies had been placed. They carried out their task with determination. They removed the bodies of Saul and Jonathan from the walls where they had been fastened. Then they brought them back across the river to their own land. There, they buried them beneath the terebinth tree, a large and long-living tree often associated with remembrance. For 7 days, they mourned, observing a period of grief and respect for the fallen king and his son. On the western side of the Jordan River, however, no such action was taken. The tribes there did not show the same courage, or perhaps they did not feel the same sense of obligation. Saul's later actions, especially his pursuit of David, had brought suffering upon the land and had weakened the loyalty of the people. Thus ended the life and rule of a king whose rise had once been welcomed with great expectation. The beginning of his reign had been marked by hope and unity, but its conclusion revealed a nation divided, weakened, and uncertain of its future.